Hello, Bill.
Good morning, Matt.
Welcome to the DMZ, everybody.
So, I always feel guilty and bad to put you on the hot seat to discuss your best friend, all the universe, Tucker Carlson. I hate to have this show come between your bromance with Tucker, but it is unavoidable to skip over what is obviously the biggest news that has happened this week.
Well, it's weird for me, Bill. I remember, when my wife a few years ago went to work for Ted Cruz as his national fundraiser, and I remember thinking, well, he's a rookie senator. It'll be at some point maybe he'll run for president, and I'll have to deal with that and put out disclaimers. But like it'll be years before he's just a backbencher, and then immediately he became very relevant. And I think with Tucker, it's really hard to not talk or write about him because he was the most popular cable news host in America, and he's been consistently driving news cycles. So it puts me in a weird position. And I'll just sort of, restate what I've said many times, which is I worked for Tucker for 6 years. He was a great boss. He was nothing but good to me. And then simultaneously, obviously, I have profound political differences with him and, the way that his show ended up going. And there are, as you know, Bill, there are a lot of people out there who worked with Tucker. For example, people at the Weekly Standard who literally worked in the same office with him.
Weekly Standard being Bill Kristol's
Yeah.
neoconservative magazine, which no longer
People like
exists.
Bill Kristol and David Frum and David Brooks and Jonathan V. Last and Andy Ferguson. There are so many people, Fred Barnes, who have, and then Democrats, maybe people like Paul Begala, who worked with him and was very good friends with him at CNN. And so, as you can imagine, like what happened to Tucker is like a very frequent dinner conversation. And honestly, I don't know that anyone has a definitive answer for anything.
Well, I mean, insofar as he went from being a more traditional conservative to more of an America First type, I think he's been pretty open that the way the Iraq War went was affected him. It's like that isn't strange, but and he was always combative. He did when he was at MSNBC, he would mix it up with Rachel. When he was on CNN, he mixed it up with Bagala. But there was a sort of good-natured element to it, and that personality shift when he went to Fox seems a bit harder to explain.
Well, I think let me throw a couple things at you. We'll start with this one. At MSNBC and at CNN, he's part of an ensemble cast in some cases, certainly doesn't have complete control of the show. And he's living in like Washington, D.C. Compare that to Fox, where he seemed to have a tremendous amount of power and autonomy over his show. He's the host, right? It's not Crossfire. He's the host. And he's living in like Florida and Maine, kind of, and filming from there. He's not, post COVID, post protesters showing up at his house. He's no longer recording in the DC studio. And that is one difference, or some differences, I would say.
No, I mean that could make you sort of socially isolated, I guess. But none of that I really explained. I mean, when he was at CNN and MSNBC, I'm not aware of him flirting with essentially racist viewpoints, replacement theory, um, comments he made in interviews about. I mean, he made a comment, I think it was to the Atlantic, that immigrants are the reason why the Potomac River has litter, stuff like that. He wasn't known for that in his early TV career. I mean, Pat Buchanan always had uh, questions raised about his feelings towards Jews. He was defending people who were accused of being part of the Nazi regime. Earlier in her career, so there wasn't a heel turn there with Buchanan.
Well, but
Uh,
Buchanan also, and Tom Nichols was on my video podcast yesterday. We're having major audio issues with my podcast, tech issues, but we were on YouTube. You can find it. And Tom Nichols and I, we were talking about how, like, when we were coming up, you couldn't be a conservative who lived in a bubble because there weren't that many alternatives to get your information from as a conservative. And if you wanted to be persuasive and to persuade people, you couldn't exist in a bubble. Um,
you're gonna vamp a little bit more while I find this dog's ball so she'll be
okay.
quiet.
So for the audience out there, the point I'm making is that, like, Pat Buchanan, although he, may have had views that were outside the mainstream, he had to exist in the mainstream media. He was on CNN, he was on the McLaughlin Group, he was arguing with liberals on CNN, on the McLaughlin Group, and he was nice to them. He was friendly. He was a happy warrior who was arguing with liberals, and so Buchanan may have had viewpoints that were outside the mainstream, but he certainly had I think, a temperament, and he had to ultimately. Ultimately, he was fired by MSNBC, but he had to coexist. This is falling apart, Bill. Our show's falling apart, Bill.
I'm sorry, man.
That's all right. Pat Buchanan had to exist in a world where the liberal media had something of a monopoly. He had to exist in that world, and he had a demeanor where he got along with those people. So he didn't have carte blanche authority. Maybe he did in his column, but to a greater extent. But he certainly couldn't just say whatever he wanted night after night.
I mean, and Buchanan, there was a convivial nature to Buchanan that
Yeah,
uh, arguably blinded people to some of the worst parts of his worldview and allowed him to sustain a career in establishment media for a very, very long time. Uh, you know, Tucker had to go to Fox, and Fox gave him a very long leash. He's saying some pretty horrible things at many different points, and is regularly featured on Russian state television because he's echoing Putin so often. Uh, and it's still a little unclear what exactly was the breaking point and why why the fall was so sudden.
yeah,
But it seems like part of it is using the C word to refer to his
yeah.
boss and and not even just saying it once, but like not even apologizing for, or even worried if that becoming public because he hated her so much.
All right, I do have some thoughts on this, specifically this part. First, having worked at the Daily Caller for 6 years, um, there was it was an outrageous environment, um, and it was super fun, and people would say things that were outrageous to get a rise out of you, like to be funny. It was not done in a mean spirited way. Um, but if someone had taped a random day, we would probably all be out of jobs at this point and just unemployable. Um, and so I think that there was a contrarianness and an orneriness that was everyone was in on, good natured, would not have translated well. But with Tucker specifically, there is a pattern. Bill, you may recall the Sarah Palin Milfistan tweet. There was another incident where I think he had been emailing, he meant to email his brother Buckley. I think he might have accidentally sent an email, but back to the wrong person. But he called de Blasio's spokesperson a quote self-righteous, I'll just say B word.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so there's a pattern of kind of using outrageous, promiscuous language, and also of sort of trollish behavior. I don't know if you remember this, but Tucker bought at some point KeithOberman.com and set up like Keith at KeithOberman.com and these different email addresses. And whenever he would respond to like media inquiries as if he was Keith Olbermann. And when he was later questioned about it, he said something to the effect of, I think quoting maybe the Apostle Paul, the flesh is weak. I forget exactly where that quote is, but
this seems different than telling inappropriate jokes and being a prankster and wanting to push the envelope and get a rise out of people. I mean, we can argue whether that is um, just good-natured fun or whether it's inappropriate in the workplace or what have you. From what was characterized in the Wall Street Journal article yesterday, was he said something deliberately mean about his boss and had zero interest in apologizing for it and was happy for the world to know he said something mean about her. I mean, that's beyond just like, telling an inappropriate joke.
yeah, it is. But I do think that if indeed that was what did it, if indeed that was the thing that took him down, like not the content, not the worldview, but the C word, then you could say like check yourself before you wreck yourself. Like there's a pattern of saying outrageous things and occasionally getting busted for it. There was a huge controversy about the Milfistan thing. There was a huge controversy about the de Blasio. People have mostly forgotten it. I'm kind of amazed that I remember it. And there's probably a lot of stuff I've blocked out or forgotten over the years. And I think that you could say that maybe if he had reined in that tendency, um, he could have gotten away with all the other stuff, with the positions. That maybe the positions weren't the thing what took him down. It was the tendency to call people bad words. I think Don Lemon is a similar story. Well, similar in the sense that I think that I mean, a few years ago he told me to shut up on TV. That there was a sort of an acerbic nature and like I'm going to do what I want to do. This is my show attitude that could have possibly been reined in, and eventually it caught up probably to him. That's my lesson. It's not sexy. It's not a sexy. I probably can't write this because it's boring, but I think that there is a lesson that a lot of times the thing that takes you down is something that has been a part. I don't want to say a sin or a habit that has been lingering for a long time that finally catches up to you.
We probably should talk Don Lemon too, if you're comfortable with that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm much more. I used to do Don Lemon's TV show all the time. I've probably been on TV with Don Lemon for hours and hours and hours. But I knew Tucker and was much more friendly with Tucker than Don.
Right. Well, let's stay at Tucker for a little bit first, though. So one more question about what Tucker might have been thinking. Is it possible that this was quasi-deliberate on his part, that he knew he was playing with fire and it didn't really bother him if he got fired because it would just mean he could do the same thing through Rumble or Substack or whatever. There's so many ways to have your own platform these days that it didn't really concern him if he lost the Fox News platform.
I mean, it's pure speculation here.
But as far as which one his personality type, does he think he's enough of a survivor that being confined to a cable TV schedule, having bosses at all? I mean, if you're calling your boss, offensive names and not caring about, maybe you still like having a boss and didn't want to have a boss.
Thing is, I could have called Tucker that and he wouldn't have fired me. I know it's not the same. I mean, I don't know if you remember this, Bill. I used to do the DMZ, and I would on air challenge people to try to get me fired from the Daily Caller. Like, please email Tucker and tell, you know what I mean? And it was really refreshing. One of the things I liked about Tucker is I kind of knew he had my back, and that it would be really hard to imagine me doing or saying something, especially me, because I am, as you know, I'm very temperamentally safe and cautious and conservative, and so it's hard to imagine that I could have gotten fired for something I said at the Daily Caller. I don't know. I think he definitely prizes independence. He and I think, though, I mean, walking away from that money and that audience, I can't imagine anyone inviting that to happen, wanting. It's hard for me to imagine anyone wanting that to happen.
Well, to slightly shift
And
topic.
you and I, by the way, you and I are available if CNN or Fox would like to do some counter programming.
Well, what do you think this means in terms of uh, the future of Fox and the future of the Republican Party, the future of conservatism? Tucker represents, along with Trump, a American first worldview that is fairly Russia friendly, although more negative towards China. He is more willing to criticize corporate influence, blending that the way DeSantis does with wokeism. To the corporatism and wokeism, things sort of intertwining. But there was a kerfuffle at the American Prospect, a progressive magazine, because they wrote a piece after Tucker's firing. There was an ode to Tucker, and talking about how he was getting it right on a lot of these corporate critiques, and that was hurting working class America. And a bunch of progressive commenters like, what the fudge, American Prospect? What are you doing? And the editor-in-chief, David Dayan, gave a kind of apology afterwards and didn't take the piece down, but said there'd be another piece coming forth from other writers at the magazine. So forgive me for that digression, but does Tucker leaving Fox impact the ideological direction of the party, of the movement, or does it just mean this all still exists? It's just going to live somewhere else but Fox, and therefore Fox has to worry about how are they going to cater to that constituency? Do they have to replace Tucker with someone Tucker-like so they still have a foot into this new aspect of conservatism?
It'll be Tucker light, not Tucker like, Tucker light. So there's got to be somebody who can be sort of flirt with the populism, but be more sanitized. I mean, I think that's probably what you do. And I think it's entirely possible that Fox, they're going to take a little dip, but eventually they'll be back to where they were with 3 million viewers or whatever at 8 o'clock, whatever it is. And they'll be fine. And Tucker's going to do great too. But I think for people like me who have my Reagan conservative worldview, probably this would be a net plus, because I think that, people who tune in to Tucker the podcast, for example, are kind of self-selecting. Whereas Fox News primetime perch, you're able to persuade and change minds and kind of recruit people and make them more nationalistic, more populist, whatever. Um, and so I think that this is taking a player off the field. If you're against kind of the forces of Trumpism, I think this is a net plus. And I think, it could be a win-win in terms of Tucker is still going to be fine, and I think Fox rebounds eventually.
So let's go to Don Lemon for a little bit.
Okay.
Were you surprised he got fired?
No, I don't think so, and not only because um, there've been like so many events leading up to this, right? So like he gets moved from his nighttime show to the morning, and there was some like back and forth as to whether like they were even like when they moved him to the daytime show, there was a question as to whether they would even keep him. Right, this is when Chris Licht takes over. They move him to the daytime show, and then there has just been so many rumors that he's not getting along with Caitlin Collins and Poppy Harlow, his co-hosts. Then you had the big brouhaha over what he said to Nikki Haley, or about Nikki Haley being
Pastor Prime.
Pastor Prime. That got a huge backlash. And then most recently, he had this kind of on-air argument with, is it Vivek? I don't know how to pronounce his name yet, but a Republican candidate. They had another fight, and I think Don fighting with people like me at 11 or 12 o'clock at night on his own show was fine. Doing it over breakfast probably wasn't a good thing.
It didn't seem like it was a weird hire. It was a weird shift for him because he has been very combative on air, and there's plenty of people combative on TV. But it's not typical morning show fare. Morning show is chummy chatter.
Yeah.
The sense that everyone's getting along on air and they're having a little breakfast chat about what's going on in the news. And if he's already has a reputation of having sharp elbows in the newsroom, not to mention being sexist, that wasn't going to lead to a very amicable vibe for your morning show. So it just seemed like granted, there's new leadership at CNN, and maybe these guys aren't as sharp as Jeff Zucker was, despite whatever weaknesses he had. So they're learning what works and what doesn't on morning TV. But I think that was sort of a weird choice in the first place.
Well, I see what they were trying to do, though, because there's a world in which Don Lemon never had a night show and was a star in the morning. Like there is a likability and a charisma, and he could turn it on, and he could have been great in the morning. But I think that because of him having had his own night show and now being, going from sort of having your own show and getting to fight with people, and then like being put early morning in an ensemble cast. Like, look, if CNN had hired Don Lemon 10 years ago and given him that morning spot, he would have probably been awesome at the morning, and he would have been great. He'd been grateful to have the job, and he would not have felt entitled or empowered or whatever. But I think that it was seen as something of a demotion. He wasn't, it's like anything else. When there's a time when you're kind of young and eager to please, and you're willing to kind of take your lumps and put on a fake smile, even if you don't feel like it. But at a certain point, as Kevin Costner says in Bull Durham, I'm too old, for I'm thinking Danny Glover for a second there, but it was Kevin Costner who said something like, at my age, I don't try out anymore for the minor leagues. And I think maybe just like I'm done with this. And he didn't have the capacity to BS anymore and to kind of suck it up and pretend to be friendly. Like, I think his kind of true self came out. And that's a problem sometimes.
Let me shift gears completely to debt limit, if I may.
Yeah, please. I've been opining on my opinions, but let's hear some actual reporting or detail.
I have a confession to make, Matt. I was reading Mark Halperin's Substack newsletter.
Well, you know who's a big fan? John Podhoretz talks him up a lot on the commentary podcast, which I like. And it does seem like obviously he was involved in a like a Me Too type scandal.
Yeah.
And, it does seem like 5 years ago or something, he was considered one of the smartest, most important commentators in America. And now nobody talks about him. And so if he was valid, if he had valid takes 5 years ago, then did he just become dumb overnight?
Well, of course, there are plenty of people that say he did not have valid takes 5 years ago. I really liked ABC's The Note, which was one of the early political newsletters. There were a lot of progressives that didn't like it, thought it was you're chock full of bad takes, but I actually thought it was very useful. And I forget where I saw somewhere. I think it was Semaphore. Semaphore had a thing about the state of digital media and how sort of what's old becoming new again. And they sort of mentioned how a lot of insiders are reading Mark Halperin's newsletter. I'm like, isn't this already good now? And I went to look at it and I was like, you know what? I don't think it is. I actually don't like the current newsletter, although I did subscribe to it. But I was curious, so I was checking it out. And so he made a point this morning that there is liberal bias in the mainstream media. Not necessarily that it is the biggest problem we have as a nation, but that it exists. And one example he gave was the treatment the media gave to Kevin McCarthy getting this debt limit spending cut bill passed. That if a Democrat had done that, there'd be all this news coverage about what a triumph it was politically. And now it is a below the fold back page story. And if you follow me, Matt, I've been tweeting about debt limit a lot.
Yeah.
And I think it's an important story. And I think it is in one sense, a success for McCarthy to do this, especially because a lot of people thought he couldn't do it, that the caucus is the majority is so narrow and the ideological span is so wide that there wasn't a sweet spot to find. And he deserves credit for pulling it off. But I don't like the Halpern analysis for two reasons. One, it is, one chapter in what it still is a long book yet to be written. So you don't want to overplay it as a success. And two, there is a lot of other news going on that's not procedural legislative weeds. And so I don't think it's demonstrably bad news judgment to say this isn't the biggest story. It is if you're me and like you're focused on these things. But and maybe it would have been bigger 20 years ago, pre-Twitter, pre-Facebook, really, when Washington news judgment was different and wasn't as influenced by what moves on social media. I don't think debt limit stories get a lot of traction on Twitter. I don't think my stories get a lot of traction on Twitter when I read about debt limit.
No, it's definitely true. I would say a lot of insidery stories. Just it used to be from the campaign world. Like if someone signed up, so-and-so operative is joining the Romney campaign, or Romney got this guy, this Des Moines field organizer. Like that would get buzz. And now it's like, well, Donald Trump's on trial for rape right now. I mean,
exactly. Exactly. So, and the other thing that I think, and this is to be more insidery, yes, McCarthy did something legislatively difficult by getting his team on one page and positioning him to force Biden's hand and start negotiations. And I wrote last week that Biden should start negotiations and he should say, I'll talk with McCarthy about the budget, but not debt limit per se. And guess what? Biden essentially said as much yesterday in a
Well,
press
ahead of the
conference.
curve, ahead of the curve once again.
Once again. But in the midst of McCarthy doing this, he says publicly, this is so we can get to negotiations. These are not the final provisions of what's going to be in the eventual deal. So McCarthy is acknowledging, yeah, I got to 217. He didn't even get 218. He actually would have lost the vote if two Democrats showed up to the vote, but they didn't show up for whatever reason. He's saying, I got 217 for something that they all know is not going to be the deal. We all winked and said, you know what, we don't really all agree on this, but we just want to make it hard for Biden to say no to talks. So yeah, I think he's going to get in the room with Biden probably now, but he's doing so with a demonstrably weak hand. He can't go into that room and say, I got 218 for this bill, and these provisions are going to be non-negotiable. I can't promise you that if I accepted this offer you're giving me, that they'd agree to it. They are rock hard for 1% annual cuts for the next 10 years. He can't do that. So yeah, I think there are going to be talks, but he's going in with a weak hand, and I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful this leads to a debt limit increase. We don't default. I'm hopeful that I think Biden having a weekend is good for America, that they can find a deal that he can bring back to his caucus. And sure, he'll lose the Matt Gaetzes, but he'll pick up Democrats because Biden's on board. And just maybe he can do that without losing his speakership. Maybe the Gaetz folks are cowed enough that they'll stomp their feet, but not actually do a motion to vacate. Like, that's the best news for everybody. But it's not it's not evidence of McCarthy's strength in this role. It's evidence that he's being politically clever and perhaps showing an ability to survive in a very tenuous situation, but it's not the same as having strength.
Let me go. I want to go back to the Mark Halperin media bias angle real quick, because Bill, I'm a believer in liberal bias, and I certainly think that the problem I have is we're lacking now a control group, because the media may not be media bias as much as media prejudice. Like, you can't divorce what we've seen from the modern Republican Party and Kevin McCarthy from the context of all of this. So what I'm saying is, do I believe that the media would have buried an accomplishment that Speaker Paul Ryan made? Yes. Yes, I believe the media would have treated that less favorably than they would have treated Nancy Pelosi doing something. But I also think that because this modern Republican Party has been so weird, and we've seen like Kevin McCarthy get onto Mar-a-Lago and invigorate Donald Trump. We've seen him wheel and deal and negotiate with Matt Gaetz to become speaker. We've seen him give Tucker Carlson footage of the January 6th riot, privileged footage of security cameras. That it's like, it's hard for me to divorce like the media's treatment of him, specifically of McCarthy, and sort of not kind of conflate that with like what is real liberal bias. Does that make sense? I know I didn't express that well, but do you get my point?
Restate it one more time, because I got distracted because I got pinged to do a meeting in 12 minutes.
See, I'm watching your reaction, which is one of confusion, which then leads me to realize that I'm not being clear, and then it spirals out of control. My point is that, Kevin McCarthy has specifically some weird bad stuff, right? Like going to Mar-a-Lago and, bringing back Donald Trump's career on the Republican Party, and giving Tucker Carlson security footage of the January 6th riot, and all of that. And so it's hard for me to discern what is like liberal media bias, which I believe exists and has always existed, from a certain skepticism and treatment of Kevin McCarthy and the current incarnation of the Republican Party
Well,
specifically.
to Halperin's point, McCarthy, he has not developed a Nancy Pelosi like aura around him. He's
Yes,
seen
yes.
as
And
a
then the question is, how much of that is liberal bias versus you have to deserve victory? You have to find a way to earn that. Where the like in sports, the umpire, if you're a great player, the ump will give you the benefit of the doubt so you've earned a little bit
well.
of
And
something.
look, Pelosi got horrible media treatment for a very long time. It wasn't like, oh, Pelosi is the queen of the house, iron fist, the entire time she was speaker. There was all sorts of stuff how she was a liability for the party in mainstream media, news articles, punditry, and the like. It's because she's a survivor, because she didn't let those takes break her stride, and was able to muscle through significant legislation at several points in her career. That's what built up that reputation. Now McCarthy's just starting out being speaker. He comes in with he got the job through pandering, so he starts on a weak note. He's been supine to Trump, and we've seen leaked phone calls about him saying one thing privately and saying another thing publicly. So the reputation he comes in with is not great. But to the Halperin point, he beat those expectations and got this bill through. So perhaps I do think he deserves the beginning of a
Yeah.
reassessment. It's so early. It's just one thing. It's just one step in a larger story that's not written yet. But people should be thinking about, maybe he has certain political skills. I mean, if he can actually hammer out a deal with Biden that doesn't go nearly as far as what the Freedom Caucus types want, and get that through the House, even without the Freedom Caucus people on board, and still remain as speaker after that is completed,
Yeah.
that would argue, this person has some political skills.
Bill Parcells says you are what your record says you are. If Kevin McCarthy starts putting points on the board, starts surprising us, then he will get probably better coverage and the benefit of the doubt. Is that kind of where you're going, Bill Scher?
Yes, but I'd also add to that, this is somewhat similar for McCarthy, let's assess the Freedom Caucus types here, the Gates types here. These guys had talked a real big game for a long time, and I just see one flinch after another. They said we gave McCarthy the gavel because he was going to push for a 10-year balanced budget. Well, he is not doing that. And even though 4 Republicans voted against this deal, are they rushing into the motion to vacate? No, they are not. Nancy Mace, who's not really part of the Freedom Caucus group.
I don't know where Nancy Mace is. I can't figure Nancy Mace out. She is a conundrum wrapped in an enigma. I don't even know what that is, but like she's all over the map.
Yeah.
I'm fascinated. I really am.
Well,
But
it wasn't that long ago where she said, we should not throw Ilhan Omar off of foreign relations. We should not be punishing people for their opinions. This is cancel culture. I'm going to vote no on that. Push comes to shove. Well, I voted no because I talked to McCarthy and he explained it this way, and now I look at it differently. So here she says, well, I'm gonna vote no on this thing because it's not a 10-year balanced budget. I talked to McCarthy and now I think it's good.
there's no coherence, no consistency, but she manages to get a lot of publicity by saying kind of extreme things on both ends, right? She'll sometimes take a firm stand as a moderate and stake out some kind of brave territory, but then she'll go the other direction and oscillate. It's very
I think maybe she got McCarthy's commitment to push some bills of hers. I mean, It's not unprecedented for people to grandstand and withhold their vote close to a deadline to see what they can get for it. Fine, that you're playing the game. Go ahead and play the game, but we're seeing a pattern form here with these folks on the fringe that they may say no, but it might well mean there's a way to get me to yes. So and that makes McCarthy's job easier. So to the extent that that dynamic presents itself, maybe McCarthy's job isn't as hard as we're making it out to be. And we should all be a little circumspect when folks say no, even if it is 24, 48 hours before go time.
Bill, I must confess, I don't know if it's showing. I'm harried. I am surly. I'm in a bad mood, dyspeptic, not in a good mood, and I want to go on and I'm under the gun too. But I just want to go on a quick rant because this is where I do that. This is my safe space.
Mm-hmm.
So on Monday, I went on Morning Joe, and the general tenor of the show was Republicans are too extreme on abortion. And I stood up for the pro-life cause. I did acknowledge from a political standpoint that some of the positions Republicans are taking are politically unpopular. Just as an analyst, you have to admit that. But I kind of stood up for the pro-life cause and a culture of life. And I tried to do it in a way that was kind of persuasive and compassionate, not being a jerk about it. How many pro-lifers do you think reached out to compliment or thank me? Couple. So then the next day, I write a column for the Beast pointing out the insane number of people, Republicans and people on the right, who've engaged in like behavior that by conservatives' own standards, these are allegations. I'll just give you some names and I think you'll know where I'm going with this. So like Rudy Giuliani, George Santos, Matt Schlapp, Ali Akbar. I could have thrown in Jason Miller. I forgot about him. Donald Trump. Get on the list. If the NFL had as many prominent players who were involved in allegations, you would say, wow, this is a real culture problem. I remember the Dallas Cowboys in the 90s had a lot of scandals and stuff. And then I heard from a lot of conservatives, people who didn't thank me. Now, by the way, I've given up a long time ago expecting anyone to cheerlead anything I do in this business. Like if I was hoping that I was going to be a conservative hero, keep on hoping, right? That was not going to happen. And by the way, let me say, I don't like to use the word hero to describe myself, but it's a lot easier to go on like your own radio show or on Fox News and be pro-life than it is to go on MSNBC and be pro-life. But never mind that. I did hear from a lot of conservatives who were not happy with my column pointing out all of these alleged weird stuff going on the right today. Because I pointed out your child is probably safer with a libs of TikTok teacher than he is trying to get a job in Republican politics or an internship. I mean, I'm just talking about statistically speaking, based on not even statistic, it's anecdotal, but I've heard more, the word grooming is literally true in some of the alleged incidences, not figurative, not the way that Ron DeSantis uses the term. It's literally true, allegedly, amongst young conservatives or right-wingers trying to join campaigns or causes. Anyway, I heard from a lot of conservatives who thought I was nut picking. Oh, I'm talking about some of the most prominent people on the right. And I can't even remember what else I was going to say. But that's my rant.
One quick point, and then I have to jump. I think you have a deadline to meet. The pro-life movement is having a very difficult time adjusting to the reality that they created. They, for 50 years, tried everything possible to take abortion out of the Supreme Court and make it something that is decided by voters in elections, local, state, federal. And now they're learning very quickly that when you put it in voters' hands, most voters want to maintain abortion rights. I think you're pointing out that, hey, I'm Matt Lewis, I'm pro-life. I like to see pro-life things happen, but my pro-life comrades are not doing politically savvy things to get us to that promised land, and they just don't want to hear it. They seem to want to just put litmus tests on Republican politicians and not do things on the ground to actually make voters want to support their positions.
You complete me. I think that's enough said. Let's just end it there. I'm great.
Okay.
Hero. Bill,
what do you got? You got plugs? You got plugs?
Yeah, I'll plug. I'll go first. I'm very upset about my podcast, by the way, the Matt Lewis in the News podcast. You heard before we started, you heard me on the phone with Tech. So what I want to encourage people to do is pre-order my book, Filthy Rich Politicians. That will cheer me up. That will get me in a good mood if you do that. And then also you can watch my interview with Tom Nichols at youtube.com/Matt Lewis. I think it's worth your time. So check that out.
I have a new piece up at the Washington Monthly, which is titled "Despite Age Inflation, Biden is Probably Going to Win." As I look back at what makes for a one-term president and why the Biden record so far doesn't really line up with that. It's not, again, still could. Things could still happen, of course, but I think he's in, historically speaking, good shape. So check that out, the Washington Monthly, and I'll talk to you next week.
All right, Bill. Next week I'll be in a better mood, and your dog will be outside. See you later.
Take care.